A big welcome to everyone to this conversation tonight. For those who are new to it or don't really know it or haven't heard of it, World Day of Social Justice was formed by the General Assembly of the United Nations and has been recognized since 2009. The aim of this day is to highlight development for social justice, harmony, and equality through equity, which is where we recognize the needs of individuals rather than assume and treat everyone the same. The aim of this day is to also commit to creating a framework to promote social justice. And for those of us campaigning for change, like us at Just Stop Oil, these aims are really important and really essential to us as a movement. I think it's important, before I pass over to our amazing panel, for me maybe just to take a moment to connect this to all of us and to contextualize a little bit. Climate justice is social justice. It cannot be obtained without social justice. Climate catastrophe really has its roots in colonialism and neoliberal capitalism. Therefore, justice for the climate is justice only when all of those who are systemically oppressed have been liberated. Because if not, the first to suffer from climate collapse are those who are most systemically marginalised. And with climate collapse comes social breakdown, where these injustices and inequalities will only be exacerbated. It's not only about fighting for the environment, it's about protecting people and planet and preventing social harm. I'd just like to share a quote by Martin Luther King Jr., who I think encapsulates this concept and why we're here tonight so well. An injustice anywhere is a threat to injustice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one affects all indirectly. And I think we actually cannot continue this conversation without speaking to the horror that is unfolding in Gaza and the occupation of Palestine for decades. We are watching a genocide being systematically carried out by a Zionist regime that completely disregards human life. And we cannot go on without recognizing what is happening in other parts of the world. If we're in the UK, we must recognize and speak up for other parts of the world. We can't talk about climate or social justice without standing in solidarity with Palestine, with the Congo, with Sudan, with all communities under duress and struggle, with those whose lives are already being destroyed by climate injustice. All people deserve liberation, to be safe and embodied in themselves, and to look to a livable future. This systemic injustice really weaves its way across our societies, across our globe, creating so many issues and challenges, some of which the amazing panel will be explaining and talking through tonight for us. And it is those in power, like Western governments, who uphold these injustices. The UK government has proven time and again that they are reacting too little and way too late. Their complicity is grotesque. Their cowardice is very apparent. Time and again, they have gone back on their words. Time and time again, they choose money and military power over people. They do not care for our futures, or else they would be bold and committed to take measures that make sure we have a livable future. And of course, I'm speaking generally there, but I think a lot of us, particularly those in the UK, can really feel that message. And it's once again people like us who are standing up and resisting these decision makers that are choosing genocides over dignified, safe lives, we will not stand idly by and allow them to continue to kill us. They must be held accountable. The corrupt interests and systems they try to hide from us must be brought into the light, and the real criminals must be charged. And it's in times like this, it's so essential that we unite and we come together and we pull our strength and resources to continue to make change. And countless intelligent and brave activists have been saying this for decades. To truly stand in solidarity and achieve social justice, we need a deeply intersecting unity. And by intersectionality, which is a word you'll hear a lot this evening, we mean that movements are not mutually exclusive, but they interweave and inform each other. And it's about listening and learning from each other. Therefore, an integrated, inclusive, and intersecting movement is a movement that is united, it's stronger and more powerful. And this will help us to face challenges, hopefully have longevity, and enact real, meaningful change. So we set the tone a bit for tonight, and really why this conversation is so important. But our panel will be able to speak so much more eloquently and in more depth. And we're very lucky to have such amazing people to speak with us tonight. During this conversation, if you have a question that you would like to ask the panel or a particular member of the panel, then please submit it through the Q&A function. Again, you'll find that in your toolbar or in the chat, and that will send directly to the co-hosts. And we'll have time to ask a couple of the questions. So let's get started, I think, with our first panelist. Is the incredible Nyombi Morris, who's joining us. Nyombi is a passionate and dedicated climate activist and speaker who's been advocating for environmental justice and policy change since 2019. He's the founder and CEO of Earth Volunteers, a non-profit organization that aims to restore ecosystems and educate communities on climate action voluntarily, with a mission to reach at least 1.5 million young people by 2030. It's an honor to have you here, Nyombi. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Bea, for this wonderful introduction. As she said, I'm a founder of Earth Volunteer, and have been radically speaking about justice for years, especially on this day, the World Day of Justice, social justice. It should remind us how far we have come and the suffering ahead of us. We have all seen that the fossil fuel industry is divesting away from fossil fuel from the West, but channeling billions of money in Africa to extract more oil and gas and set up gas stations all over. Today, our fellow 11 frontline fighters are rotting in jail in Uganda for just protesting against the East Africa crude oil pipeline, which is heavily funded and fueled by the selfish, fresh multinational company, Total Energy. At the same time, we are seeing emphasis wealthy nations are using in investing heavy resources into preventing Black minorities and Africans from migrating to their country. I wonder, and I believe, if they should have channeled this very effort towards a fair and a just transition for all. It is not fair to claim that you are environmental conscious while simultaneously supporting environmental harm in other countries. It is time for us to acknowledge that the suffering our people are going through must stop. Africa is a least contributor to greenhouse gas emission, yet we are the ones who are suffering the most due to the damage caused by this emission. It is important to note that we cannot continue this suffering for other nations' wealth. This is has to come to an end. Today, we are witnessing countries suffering from devastating floods, and rich countries seem to turn a blind eye because it is not happening to their side. For instance, in Malawi, last year, over 400 people lost their lives due to floods resulting from severe damage of food, infrastructure, and unfortunately, the country is still struggling to recover from this disaster. No one has cared. We are in 2024, 1 year later, no one has checked to see if Malawi is actually okay. Also, let's take a look at Niger Delta, where hunger and poverty has been rampant for centuries. Since the discovery of oil reserve in Nigeria, numerous communities in the region of Niger Delta have been experiencing devastating oil spills for companies such as Shell and ExxonMobil in 2009. Despite they generating billions of money in dollars every year, these companies have done very little to improve the living lives of these communities they have exploited. Lakes have been polluted with oil, making fish impossible. The land also contaminated, making agriculture unavailable. The affected communities continue to suffer while oil companies are celebrating billions of money. At the beginning of 2023, Shell announced over 40 billion profit they made in 2022. At the beginning of 2024, in February this very year, ExxonMobil announced over $30 billion in dollars profits. So I wonder, when will we collectively acknowledge that oil doesn't have a place in this world? Because communities are crying and no one is really care. When will we start to hold capitalism accountable for its action? How many times must we witness our fellow humans being suffer for starvation when we have been blessed with everything by God? Come to Africa, the natural resources, the food, everything was okay until the industry came to our countries. And guess what? Everything is down. How many dead bodies and coffins must we compare up for you guys to start caring that actually we have exploited these people enough? Now we have to give back. Although we are speaking about climate change today, it is important to note that it is exacerbating the existing global inequality and hindering effort to alleviate poverty. A report that was published by World Bank last year estimated that global ecological crisis might drive up to 135 million people in global south into poverty by 2030. We are already in 2024, and the suffering is actually going beyond the number they estimated. Despite benefiting from climate change, many billionaires can't even spare $1,000 per month out of their pocket to go to the affected communities they exploited. But they keep celebrating their philanthropy in magazines and legacy media, competing to become the richest people in the world for coming up with innovations that is saving the vulnerable communities, which is a lie. It is actually a lie, because we are not seeing anything. These communities are benefiting from the innovation apart from the suffering that was fueled by them. Lastly, we all know that the green economy has turned into a green slavery in countries like Congo. The rise of child labor in mining sites in Africa can't be ignored, not anymore, because Western investors choose profit over life. They prefer using kids instead of adults because they can be easily manipulated and compromised at a cheaper price. This is what we have turned into. This is what countries are going through. This is what countries are paying for the renewable transition. It is not fair because the suffering is not what we expected and is not what we discussed onto in Paris Agreement. We are watching this closely and everyone will have to pay. Today, we are celebrating World Day of Social Justice, but there can't be social justice, to be honest, in a green economy full of green slavery. It can't. This suffering is too much. We either stop the suffering or the communities that have faced this suffering will rise up. Even if you close borders, they will rise up for this unfair just transition. We either stop because it is turning to be a scam. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nyombi. So powerful. I'm just sitting with that. But thank you so much, and we'll hear more from Nyombi in our Q&A. So our next speaker is Stuart Bretherton. Stu has been involved with direct action groups against the fossil fuel industry, arms trade and hostile environment, as well as community organising with tenants' unions and refugee solidarity networks. What amazing work. Since 2022, Stu has coordinated Fuel Poverty Action's Energy for All campaign, demanding a universal energy guarantee, which is a fairer energy pricing system that delivers a Green New Deal. Can't wait to hear more. I'll pass over to you, Stu.
Thank you, Bea. My mum was passing through and rolling her eyes at that introduction you gave me. I feel a bit of an imposter among this panel, but thank you for having me. I was invited to speak about the intersection of fuel poverty and fossil fuels. There's a million things that I could say on this, but to be honest, I feel like you'll have heard so much of it before. We all know that the cost of living crisis is just a rebranded gas crisis, how oil and gas now costs between 4 and 9 times more to produce than renewable energy, and that it's complete bullshit that net zero is the problem that's driving up our bills in the UK. But I wanted to bring different perspective to this because we all came, I assume, to build new knowledge and new power towards social justice. So from a UK perspective, that's what I'll aim to do. A core part of the Poverty Action's philosophy and the Energy for All campaign, which Just Stop Oil supports, is that we have a right to energy, a human right to energy. Sometimes we encounter a bit of discomfort among environmentalists at this concept. You know, they maybe feel the need to clarify, yes, but as long as it's renewable energy or whatever. And, you know, I'm not diminishing the importance of that, but it's not necessarily what people want to hear if they're on a dialysis machine or if you're a single parent trying to feed the meter just to keep your kids warm till payday. And any limitations that we place on this right is ultimately going to exclude people worldwide from, you know, Indigenous communities in the global south to right here at home. We've got traveller communities that have held a closer connection to land and ecology throughout history that are often relying on solid fuels like wood, coal, sometimes oil, gas bottles, of course. These are communities that we can't forget about in our vision for a green transition. So under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of themselves and their family, noting essentials like food, clothing, housing, medical and social care. This list is non-exhaustive. I mean, water is absent, but it clearly applies. No one's going to argue that. And the same goes for energy to meet this standard of living. We believe that this is a value that the climate movement has to embrace to demonstrate its commitment to social justice without any ifs and buts. Next, we need to put communities first. In the UK, the anti-net zero agenda is a huge challenge, but lives being made worse by green initiatives isn't always conspiracy theory. It's the reality of what policy under this government and previous governments has actually delivered. And if we simply ignore that, then we're going to lose the argument ultimately. In FPA, we've encountered harsh realities, for example, around housing. The climate movement has suddenly woken up to this pivotal area that we need to push on, and you know, credit to Stuart Bretherton for their role in that. But the movement is catching up. The struggle for housing justice is one of the oldest on earth, and to focus purely on the urgency of our own agenda will do serious damage if we're not wise to pitfalls. Every government scheme of the past decade has been a complete shambles to the point that we've actually seen communities organising against retrofit. Take members of ours in Pendleton Estate in Salford. They were subject to a retrofit years in the making, with consultation from a wide range of so-called experts. The high flats they live in were retrofitted with cladding that made them identical to Grenfell Tower. And following that tragedy, it was removed, leaving them back in the cold. Kingspan, a commonly used insulation material, is combustible, it's carcinogenic, and doused in large quantities of petroleum. And if we don't dig into the detail, this is the sort of thing that's going to be delivered when the retrofit revolution is ultimately won, despite all of the evidence pointing to natural materials such as wood and hemp being safest and healthiest options for insulating our homes. The same goes for heating systems. The likes of heat pumps, of course, have an important role to play, but there's a queue of cowboys in this country ready to take advantage of incentivisation schemes, leaving households with botched jobs that don't deliver efficiency or lower bills. And we've seen the reality of that from people we work with in the UK. One of our most active cases right now is in Lambeth, a council estate which is on a heat network, which is where rather than having your own boiler and getting electricity from the grid, you're on a local communal energy system for your block or an estate or a local area. Again, supposed to drive efficiency. And again, we've seen the opposite happening, especially when the private sector is involved. These tenants in Lambeth saw their energy bills rise by 350% under the system, making them completely unaffordable. And Lambeth Council's response has been eviction notices. It's actually the first case we've ever been aware of where tenants are being threatened with eviction over unpaid energy bills. So please follow Lambeth Tenants Heat Campaign on Twitter and amplify their story as much as you can. We're going to be fighting that for the coming weeks. Fuel Poverty Action's campaigned on these exact issues for over a decade now. We were born out of the climate camp movement, and we take direction from affected communities and let the issues on the ground guide our strategy. One strand of work right now is an educational series called Fuel for Thought. This is work that actually has nothing to do with me, so I can with full modesty say it's been absolutely amazing so far. Our next session in March is public ownership, how to do it, looking at how taking control of our energy sector from the state right to community level can drive some of the changes that we need. I caught up as well on January's session, Retrofit for the Future, which welcomed architects, health workers, community organisers, all to discuss together the issues that I've raised with you tonight. And I think it's essential viewing for anyone campaigning on housing and insulation. So that's another link that I'll drop for you. In this fight, we need affected communities at the forefront of our work. And that means looking around at who's missing, creating space for people to act, or at very least vocalise the struggles they face day to day, and then actively listening to that and taking it on board. Not everyone uses the same language, the same words, but we all share an understanding, I think, of social justice, solidarity, and a fair society. So when we speak about energy for all, which is a universal energy guarantee, that speaks to people who understand that this system is rigged against us. We can toxify the likes of oil and gas without always leading with that climate framing when it doesn't apply to people or it doesn't resonate with them. So just for an example of that, I want to go full circle now and round off with what we're supposed to talk about. We know that oil and gas costs between 4 to 9 times more to produce than wind or solar energy. But how many people actually knew that the price that we as UK consumers pay for a unit of electricity is tied to the unit price of gas? They are artificially inflating prices to the highest rate in Europe, the highest rate of electricity prices in the continent, in order to keep gas competitive. That's making greener all-electric homes and these households one of the most fuel-poor demographics in the whole of the UK. I really cannot understand why FPA are one of the only groups that are calling this out and demanding that it change, because forcing government to decouple these prices could take off the brakes and help to make this demand of greener and cheaper energy a reality that we're not receiving the benefit of right now. So listening to frontline communities and grassroots groups doesn't just deliver harsh realities, as I shared earlier, but also some strategic insights. That's one that I hope you'll all be happy to take away with you. I wanted to share some of those things tonight as perspective on what we're maybe sometimes missing in our discussions, and take those forward with communities at the forefront, not taking over that space, not forcing our own agenda onto own people, but being led by example by those communities. So thank you again for having me tonight. I'll pass back.
Thank you so much, Stu. Such a valid member of this panel. No imposter syndrome necessary. Super informative as well. We shared some links in the chat to some of the work that Stu was talking about. And please do check the chat. We'll be sharing links. We shared about Nyombi's work and also links for the coming panelists. So please check it. Just a reminder, if you have a question for the panel and you want to ask them in the Q&A, please send it to us. We're so lucky to have them. So let's use their wonderful brains as much as possible. So next up, we have the amazing Lee Jasper. And we at Just the Boil have had the honor actually of collaborating with Lee in the past. Lee Jasper, for those who don't know, has been a consistent campaigner for social justice over the last 30 years and is a leading advocate for race equality and justice. He served as senior policy advisor on equalities to the then Mayor of London, Ken Livingstone, until he resigned on the 4th of March 2008. And in November 2012, Lee stood as the Respect Party candidate for the Croydon North by-election. Lee has established and co-founded and worked with or been involved with so many amazing projects for the Black community, anti-racism and charitable organizations, some of them including Black Socks, BAME, Lawyers for Justice, Black Men for Change and Black Impact, Lambeth Youth Safety Forum. I could go on, but instead I'm going to pass it over to Lee. Over to you, Lee.
Hi, and thanks. What a great panel already. I mean, awe and admiration. Yeah, my name is Lee Jasper. I represent Organised Black Socks. It's a Black social movement based on do for self. It gathers the people together who've got time and money, who are willing to commit to do things that need to be done in our communities. So it's a self-help focused collective of Black people from all over the different walks of life. I've been working with Just Stop Oil, and our organisation has been working with them through a framework of a long-term discussion now in its second year, where we developed an anti-racist allyship framework to provide context for our relationship. Black Socks doesn't believe that just by a self-declaration you're an anti-racist organisation because that's your political or theoretical perspective. It doesn't translate into anti-racist positive action necessarily. And therefore, when we're looking at organisations that are seeking to reflect the community at large, then that has to be done within a very structured way. And this is a sort of post-George Floyd phenomena. The sort of glacial progress we've seen in relation to growing levels of racial inequality, from infant mortality from the time of conception to the time of birth in your first year of life. By the time you go to school, by the time you get to secondary school, there are stacks of statistics that show you systemic racism has a massively disproportionate impact on Black and ethnic minority communities. And that's important, therefore, that organisations don't just have a theoretical understanding of what anti-racism is in a typically traditionally leftist way, but have a positive agenda. And that agenda is fashioned in institutional relationships with Black social or community organisations who are building leadership, building advocacy, representing communities on those front lines. And that's an agreement that, you know, we bring together and sets out the objectives of our relationship over the number of years. Now, this is very important because the kind of systemic change that I think we're all trying to achieve cannot be achieved by one group alone. You know, climate change activists are great, cost of living climate activists are great, other activists are absolutely fantastic, but struggling in our separate spheres means that we are, you know, less than we could be. And I think that's a lesson as well for humanity. We've got to remember the majority of humanity is black and brown. 80% of the world makes up that demographic. We are the global majority. And that's why I was so moved by our first speaker, because here you were the effects of globalization and international capitalism on the human level on the continent. And I know people think, oh, well, that's, Africa and things, and, we've got pressing problems here in the UK, and you're absolutely right. But the pressing problems include that black and brown people who are working here, who are sending money home to keep their families afloat, who are coping with climate change crisis induced by the North, are taking money from hard-earned pay packets on the lowest wages, sending money home to subsidize a climate catastrophe in Bangladesh or on the African continent or throughout the Caribbean or Latin America, because our contribution is vital to keep our families afloat, ourselves afloat in this country, and our whole families afloat abroad. And it's an aspect, I think, that hasn't been successfully or effectively understood. And we bring that perspective to the relationship with JSO. But also we want to use our privilege to make sure we're platforming voices from the global south. This intersectionality is not a domestic issue solely. Yes, we want to build critical mass between organizations who share objectives for real systemic change through building of alliances behind a movement and a political project that is capable of delivering. But it also has to be international. Because the days of rampant capitalist growth for Europe are completely over. Those days are done. All European economies are retracting and contracting, because of well, I don't want to get too complicated into international finances, but GDP rates are declining all over Europe. Economies are contracting, birth rates are falling. Racism is rising at the same time as people are trying to cut off immigration for people who can provide social care and employment opportunities for people for the global south. And at the same time, we've got an international debt relationship with the global south. That means that we have them, almost in an international vice grip in terms of debt relations and loans from the IMF and so on and so forth, which all deeply constrictive and and designed to benefit the West, not benefit those countries. It's a crying shame that the international debt of Africa continues to balloon at the rate it is, and Western countries are content to see nations plunge themselves into austerity, into war, suffer with climate catastrophe, all of that at the same time as paying their pound of flesh to the Western banker who cares not a jot for the people on the continent. And so it's very important to build alliances. And those alliances have to be wide and broad and deep, but they cannot be cosmetic, they cannot be performative, and they cannot be insincere. I'm not here to be recruited by you or anybody else. Black community is tired of being recruited, right? I think there's a famous quote, which I'll give you, from an Australian activist, actually, called Lila Watson. And Lila Watson said this, Aboriginal activist. And this is critical in relation to understanding the anti-racist perspective we're trying to build, which will be necessary for an alliance with people in the global south and indeed the African diasporas and other non-white diasporas throughout the world, and indeed working class communities. If you've come here to help me, then you're wasting your time. But if you come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then we can work together. That is the philosophical and political perspective in which genuine anti-racists present themselves. And luckily, we found that in terms of JSO's commitment and other anti-racist alliances we have with other organizations who take their anti-racism so seriously and the need to build these alliances, which cannot be just theoretical, have to be practical, have to be based on some objective, have to be based on some level of definition that grants you the right to say you're an anti-racist organization. That legitimacy can only come from institutional relationships with Black communities. And what we've been able to do with JSO is set out a great anti-racist training module that focuses on the role of slaves and sugar, which could be equated to the trade, modern day trade today in gas and oil, and all of the infrastructure required for the latter was developed during the period of the former. International insurance, global shipping of people as slaves, international law in terms of economic and commerce. All of the infrastructure was built as a consequence of the international trade. And if you look at the trade laws that were developed in order to protect that trade here today in modern, I think that politics is a dying institution. It has no real legitimacy as people lose confidence in reality. And that invites fascism, where people lose faith in democracy. Fascist threat teaches us when European economies go down, racism and always go up. And my children have been on my computer again. I apologize, fireworks. So I'll draw it to a close in this by way of saying, look, I'm uniquely optimistic because I see young people throughout the world who are rising up, coming together, and have a conscious understanding of the need to build critical mass change and build alliances. And the Black community, as one of the most experienced communities of the African diaspora here in the United Kingdom, understands the nature of that necessary alliance and is opening up to build the kind of critical mass movement capable of delivering systemic change.
Thank you so much, Lee. It's always so insightful hearing you speak, and I'm so glad that you spoke to anti-racism, really essential component to this intersectional social justice movement conversation that we're having. I really hope people resonated with that and took that on board, and hopefully we can go into it a little bit more. Fortunately, I think there was a little tech glitch, and towards the end, Lee, you were glitching a little bit, but if there was any confusion from people in the audience, please let us know, and if you have any questions for Lee, then please let us know. We want to ask them. Okay, moving on to our final speaker of the night, and it's one of our own, the amazing Emma, the Saram. Emma is a climate justice and community activist who has worked across grassroots and national campaigns, including Green New Deal Rising, Stop Cambo, and Just Stop Oil. She is a committee member of the Unite Young Members and Regional Disability Committee and Green Development Officer for Exeter District Trade Union Congress. Very impressive. Emma advocates for an intersectional climate movement that approaches the climate crisis as one symptom of a corrupt system producing a multiplicity of injustices. And perfect segue, Emma, I'd love you to go into that a little bit more. Over to you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for all the other speakers and human beings. I think sometimes, like with activism, you just sometimes become a voice rather than a human. So yeah, thank you for everyone, and thank you for having me. So yeah, no, me speaking on intersectionality and the climate crisis, I first want to obviously acknowledge my positionality in the discussion, as a white woman in the global north. Although there's injustice that I have faced, I also recognize the history and how white women have continued to uphold structures that enable the climate crisis. But first, I want to go into a little bit maybe my story with kind of climate activism and like alongside, developing a disability and, just mental health in general. So I kind of first got into climate activism quite a young age. It kind of paralleled my diagnosis with anorexia, and kind of climate activism was a way that I kind of transcended just looking very internally at like bettering my own life and internal like struggles, just kind of recovering from that. But I kind of got into direct action, and that was a very liberating experience to kind of be both paralleling the urgency of the climate crisis with the urgency of my actions, but also kind of using my body, which was something which I'd kind of been battling against like internally as a method of like resistance against a system that is killing so many people. But it was actually only about like 6 months ago or so that I kind of had to take a step back from doing direct action, because it was literally a couple of days before I was meant to go on like another week of slow marching with Just Stop Oil. But I found myself like in hospital because I'd, without like knowing for about 2 or so months, developed type 1 diabetes, which was very random. And I think it was a result of kind of doing direct action like constantly for about like a year, maybe, just being like out on the streets and constantly like putting myself in that kind of feeling like I needed to be physically in that moment of resistance, like constantly. And the first thing when I was just like taken away by an ambulance and everything, when they told me like, like, you're gonna have to go to hospital, etc. I was like, oh my goodness, but what about my slow marching? Like, what about everything? And basically, over the last 6 months, I have been very much forced to really reflect on the climate movement and my role in it, and how we're gonna undo these horrific systems. But it's also kind of it's made me a lot more hopeful. I think stepping away and taking myself away from literally the streets, I've had that time to reflect on like this movement that we're building, and like the value of everyone in it. And I think especially from like this disability perspective, like there's many things that I can't do anymore, but also there's so many things that I still can do. Um, And I think like with the climate justice movement as it is, we need to be very much aware of how like the same issues in society that have led us to the climate crisis, which is just a symptom of, colonial capitalism. We're not immune from those systems not replicating within our movement, and how we need to be like actively showing solidarity with disabled people, with, people of color, with Palestine. Like, it needs to be very much active, because the climate crisis is just a symptom of the root cause, and it's going to take time to undo that, and we're going to all have to like take steps back like as a movement and consider like what are we working towards, because the climate crisis, like, it's not a future orientated thing, and I think we're quite guilty potentially of always talking about the future, and like, we need to be fighting for the future, and it's no, we need to be fighting for the present, because if we're not, living and acting the values that we want to see in the world, then what are we doing? Like, if we're not trying to build community right now and be able to speak to our neighbors about these issues, and trying to make, as cliche as it is, but trying to make the world a better place like in the present, then we're not going to be able to do it in the future either. And I think it just essentially comes down to like collective care, and like bringing that into the movement, and learning from like history and learning from other people, and not thinking that we're going to do this, because it's not just one. I think the other speakers touched on this. It's not one movement that will solve the climate crisis. And I think my role with like the trade unions over the last few years has also kind of shone quite a lot of light on that. and understanding that we're not, these aren't like necessarily new battles, these aren't new strategies that we need to always be working on, and like even that kind of framing can sometimes replicate the same kind of like capitalist idea that we need to always be like growing and everything. And actually sometimes sustainability and like taking a step back and learning from history is so important. Like when we're talking about just transition, it's like we all need to like learn about the Lucas plan, which was led in the 1970s by like aerospace workers. They were basically like, let's convert our factory production into more socially useful products, and they did that, and that was a workers-led movement, and we need to learn from that. So sometimes taking a step back is taking like 2 steps forward, always, like learning from history, learning from, you know, many indigenous communities around the world who have been resisting you know, pipelines, oil projects before us is incredibly important. And I think it ties very much into that like anti-racism work that we need to be doing, is kind of acknowledging that we may not know the solutions, but other people have done this before us, and taking a step back in order to make this movement more sustainable and fundamentally undo the systems of oppression that have got us to now. And we're not going to be able to do that in 6 months, we're not going to be able to do that in a year, and like that's uncomfortable, but it has to be done. And I think, sorry, I'm just blabbering now, but I think there's one little like kind of quote that I want to finish on, which is by Lakota organizer, journalist and historian called Nick Estes, and he writes in a book called Our History is the Future, and it's about resisting the Dakota Access Pipeline and the long history of Indigenous resistance. And he writes about the idea of an accumulation of resistance, which is not always spectacular nor instantaneous, but that nevertheless makes the endgame of elimination an impossibility. And that's in the context of resisting colonialism. But I think we can really learn from that and build a movement which isn't just a climate movement, because fundamentally we can't just address the climate crisis, because that's just addressing the symptom of an issue of colonialism and capitalism, which is much, much, much deeper than just oil. And we need to be standing like shoulder to shoulder with people facing all forms of oppression, and doing that on an active basis, and thinking, you know, if we're building a campaign, is this going to genuinely, you know, benefit people's lives in the now as well as in the future? Because that's really important when many people are facing like a battle and like an existential threat on a daily basis, not because of oil, but because they can't pay their bills, or because they're living with a disability and they can't, you know, afford access to healthcare. And I think my experience, you know, even over the last like year, has made me realize like my like health and my existence is now like dependent on a healthcare system and free healthcare and secure global supply chains, essentially, because without that, like, you know, my existence is on the line. Like, this isn't about me, but like, you know, it's kind of like that visceral experience, and it's only kind of made me more motivated, not just, you know, for myself, but because I kind of feel a little bit, yeah, closer to like that fragility of the system. But yeah, I will be quiet now. But thank you so much for having me, and yeah.
Thank you, Emma. Thank you so much. So much beautiful stuff there that's really connecting a lot of different issues, and it's not over. We will be hearing more from yourself and the rest of the panel. So thank you all. So we have reached, I guess, the sort of quick fire round of our discussion. We've had some really great questions. I've been getting quite a few direct messages, so apologies that we won't be able to answer everybody's questions, but we'll try and get through as many as possible. and we have such a great panel to sort of talk about this from different angles. One that I wanted to start with, which is, it's quite a big question, but if we, maybe can keep our answers quite as concise as possible, but we're dealing with something really complex here. So in your opinion, what is one of the greatest obstacles or barriers that is kind of getting in the way of a really united and effective social justice? I'm going to start with, I'm going to go from the top. Nyombi, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, can you repeat the question?
Sure. So this question was from someone asking, what is, in your opinion, one of the greatest obstacles or things getting in the way of a really effective and united social justice movement?
Yeah, I can say there is lack of understanding for one another, especially our differences, because the challenges we are going through are a bit different. When you look at the boat we are in, your side, you are reporting, like right now in Global North, they have been reporting about a heat wave, and yes, we agree, there is heat wave. But in Africa, we report different way, like we are seeing floods. So we cannot be like talking about heat wave when other areas are flooding. So sometimes the fight become divided, whereby in the West, people are talking about fossil fuel every day. And in our country, we are talking about poverty, hunger, floods, landslide, drought, everything. So sometimes we end up not connecting as a group, even when we want, because the other part, in the West, it is very hard to take actions on ground because almost everywhere there is construction, there's buildings, good roads, like the construction took over even the nature you had left with. And in Africa, we are just starting. So we still have a lot to do on ground. And the movement, there is a thing that I've witnessed with my team, that the support is different when it's come to supporting the global, the climate justice movement. Those in the West receive money and the trust. There is trust when it comes to funding for such movements. But in Africa, we receive very little support. In the end, we'll be like, but we are trying and there is no support. People give up, just like that. So there is lack of trust and there is lack of funding, which make it so hard for us to be on the safe pace and talk about different things at the same time, but united.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Nyombi. I want to offer it to any of the other panelists, any of the other speakers. Any thoughts on that, or to reflect on what Nyombi's just said as well? Stu or Emma? I think Lee had to actually go due to tech problems, but Stu or Emma, do you want to jump in?
I'd definitely agree with what a lot of Nyombi said. My initial gut reaction when you posed the question, I thought about, I think a lot of us here are very comfortable with naming the systems that we're fighting against, but we're certainly facing a barrier among those who disengage as soon as you use those, you name those systems like capitalism and colonialism. I think it's a challenge that is difficult to understand how to overcome from that perspective. At least other people might have better ideas, but I think from a climate perspective, that then leads sometimes to leaning on like techno fixes, for example. And as everyone's kind of gone into, it's not just a question of oil or renewables or whatever. Nyombi's spoken a lot about green slavery, green extractivism. Obviously spoke about, it goes so far beyond oil. And from what we're seeing from a poverty perspective in this country, a lot of the solutions being put forward almost in a capitalistic way, change your home, change your car, whatever. That it's not getting to the root of the issue. So I think, I think in other countries sometimes, and among particularly younger generations in the UK, it's very common sense to name those systems, but I think we have a barrier in the UK, and a lot of people choose to disengage when we do so.
Thanks, Stu. Emma, do you have any thoughts you want to share?
Yeah, I think, yeah, kind of very similar to what Stu was saying. Like there's like this meme that like Gen Z just blame everything on capitalism, but come on. From my perspective, like I work at a university which is supposedly like a global leader on climate action, but it's just a global leader on like greenwashing. And I think a lot of the time we just aren't speaking the same language when we talk about the climate crisis. Like I'm talking about all these like systems underneath and, you know, grassroots movement, etc. But people with the wealth, right, like where the wealth is still stored, that's also like a massive barrier to like, yeah, uniting, because a lot of organizations in the climate space are still relying on funders who want to see like a certain thing delivered, and like we're still kind of having a lot of the time to operate within like the framework rather than what we really need to be doing is transcending it. But then you have the barriers of, you know, we need to survive as well. And yeah, like these techno fixes and carbon capture and everything, kind of there's like this divide. When I'm talking about climate action, I'm talking about, yeah, like liberation work, but a lot of where the wealth is still, where the power is talking about yeah, like geoengineering and trying to like fix our way out of the climate crisis. But that's where kind of like, you know, the work of like trade unions and everything is so important to kind of like bridge those gaps as well. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I really what I was particularly resonating and hearing there was that, yeah, communication or the lack of communication is such an obstacle, and like translating accessible, like speaking accessibly to different people as well, and also not sort of having these blanket sweep statements. This is the problem for everybody, and this is the cause of this for everybody. But instead listening to all of these different voices that we have. And that is why I think panels and conversations like this are so important, because we need to listen, right, to everybody from these different perspectives. Else we kind of get stuck in our echo chambers of people like us and what they think. Amazing. I just want to say Lee did have to go. I think tech and Wi-Fi was a bit of an issue. So we have 3 of our panelists left, but answering incredibly. So we'll continue. This question came up a couple of times, worded slightly differently, but the fundamental message was kind of the same. And it's about the practical element of intersectionality. So, you know, we have all this passion, we have all these amazing people doing amazing things. How do we practically kind of unite them and get them to work together? And how do we integrate intersectionality into individual organizations? It's a huge question, but if there are any burning examples or ideas that you have, I'm just going to put it out there. So if anyone wants to begin, please do.
I think sometimes like it's the wrong framing to kind of be like, how are we going to do this? I think sometimes we need to be meeting people where they're at. And I think a really tangible example of that is an organization called Football for Future, who are basically integrating the climate crisis and sustainability and inspiration in that regard into football. Kind of the message is like football is one of the most uniting kind of cultural forces that we have, shown by like, you know, just it's that, you know, people across countries, across, you know, languages may not be speaking the same language, but they can both play football and acknowledge that and support the same football team. And it's kind of how do we take that phenomenon into the climate crisis and kind of like, yeah, be meeting people where they're at. And I think that's really important, especially to sustain activism and to keep it kind of like hope and like joy orientated and focused. Because essentially like, yeah, like fear and worry will maybe get people in and like interested in taking action, but it won't sustain them for the long run. And I think that's something I've kind of like personally experienced from kind of being scared into action, like, you know, 5 or 6 years ago into where I am now. And it's kind of like, I remember meeting someone at COP26 and they said like, oh, climate activists, they only last like 3 or 4 years. And when it got to my 3 or 4 years, I was like, oh, I'm still in this. Why is that? And that was because I built like a community and like joy around being involved. Yeah.
I can add on something from Emma. What Emma said is, I think when it comes to individual organization, the challenge is there comes a time when there is no hope. I think there is a time where we all lose hope and you'll be like, oh my God, maybe it is not working. And I think we have to have some examples and stories which we can give to our friends to understand that even this tough time, there is a better time coming in, you know. So I find it difficult to keep the morale, but sometimes we use stories to show some examples, to show what we have won in previous years. And that's how we keep the unity and the organization moving, to stay focused on what we are fighting for, because we are in a world full of billionaires ready to challenge whoever challenge them, especially when it comes to oil, when it comes to things concerning climate. No one cares unless they are benefiting. So they pay so much money on the internet to make sure they spread negativity and everything. Like recently, there's a time I was seeing an advert that was advertising fossil, and it was showing examples of, there was a sick parent who was, maybe, I think the parent was looking for support, and there was no like electricity. So there is a way they made this advert, and when you look at it, you'll be like, oh my God, we need fossil more than ever before, you know, because there is a way they create image to make sure you guys hate what you're fighting for. So sometimes motivating with stories, this is what I do, and it keeps us united. And I think, yeah, this is what we do, like in my nonprofit.
Excellent, thank you. Stu, is there anything you want to add in or respond to? Maybe something you've heard?
I don't have too much to add, but I think the quote that Lee shared, which probably a lot of us have heard before, just sums it up perfectly. Like, every one of us here tonight, our liberation is bound with one another. And it's not just a quote, it's a literal fact that we all have to take away with us and carry with us all the time. And when we're, you know, approaching groups to build alliances, to build power with one another, it's just about keeping that frame. And it's not, we're here to help you, we're here to be lifted up by you. We are here because our struggle is bound together. So yeah, it's just important to carry that with us at all times, I think.
Amazing, thank you so much. We have time for maybe one or two more. So thinking of World Day of Social Justice, which is today, which is really about committing to creating a framework to promote social justice. So it's really like tangible, active stance, like Emma was talking about. What is one change that you would like to see the most amongst activists and people campaigning for systemic change? What is something that you would like to say to people who are campaigning?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. I was God, my brain is leaving me now, but I was inspired by what Emma said. First of all, that we do need to look at the short term as well as the long term. We need wins in order to mobilise, in order to inspire people. We'll probably actually really try and converge those between things that we can change today to bring energy bills down, compared to, you know, the transition in energy, the home insulation, and all these things that will take 5-10 years. So I think we need to mix both of those. And then speaking, I think, directly to Stop Oil members now, and I don't mean to say it out of any respect, but yeah, coming back to what's also been said, when I encounter like social media from Just Stop Oil and I hear people speak about the fear for their future because of decisions being made by this government, it actually doesn't move me personally. I've, you know, like a lot of people here, I've been doing this for a long time, and there's struggles that I'm encountering with people every day, and that's just in one on one issue of fuel poverty, and there's so many intersecting issues that we face, not just in this country but worldwide. So that's not something that moves me personally. That's something that I think it would be strategic to reassess, you know, whether that is having the impact that we want it to on people that aren't currently engaged in movement building and taking action. I think we should be speaking about the direct struggles that we're facing today here and across the world. personally.
Thank you, Stu. Emma or Nyombi, do you want to come back on that or add to it?
Yeah, I just want to add on that in this fight for the global inequalities, we need to make sure that we bring in the voices that are on forefront line that are being affected by climate change. Like, we need to open up doors for them to be able to share their messages to the world. Maybe the inclusivity for them will also make a difference in our movement and in our fight overall, because we have seen that there are some important voices that actually have what to say. Even when you look at the current state, there is a study that was published, I think by academic. It was showing how climate change academic actually are not supported, especially even our writers, activists who are good in writing stories. They are actually not given space to write, or even when they write, their work is not published. So these are some of the biggest challenges we face, that our voices are not heard even when we are in the movement itself. So inclusivity and opening spaces for these Global South activists to share their stories, to write, or to do anything, it can be a very powerful motivator and a very, maybe a crucial move for achieving the inequalities we are in today. Thank you.
Yeah, I just have something small to add on. I think the best kind of motivation when you're doing any kind of like social justice work is knowing that whatever kind of like little corner of the world you're working in like is making a difference. And I think my mum is kind of like the best example of that. Because basically we set up a repair cafe in my hometown after COP26, and after I'd basically come back from like these international talks, and I was just like, this is rubbish. And I called my mum and I was like, Mum, let's like start the repair cafe. And over the last kind of 2 years, she's pretty much taken that on, and she's just a complete natural like community activist, like never done it in her life. And the other day she called me and she was like, Emma, like we've got all these donations and I don't know what to do with it. And you know, she goes and takes it to the food bank, and I said to her, I was like, oh, like, do you think we should maybe consider like expanding to like a bigger venue, or maybe like saving some money to, you know, like put it into like a pot so we can buy like a venue maybe one day. And she was like, no, like, let's just give out the money. Like, I don't want money just sitting there when it could be like feeding people locally. And it was just, she's just got like this natural urge to just like not grow and just to keep things going. And people come to that repair cafe just to have a cup of tea. And like for a lot of like the older people in the area, like that's their main kind of like social interaction for the month. And it just warms my heart to know that like she is like and we are like building those connections, and to just get away from this like growth mindset and actually just be like, this is okay, and we are doing something here and it's so meaningful. And I think it's just holding on to that, like whatever little corner of the world you're chipping away at is so needed.
Thank you. A beautiful end message, actually, that we can all do something and we are all doing something. Yeah, comparison also maybe not is not helpful to our movements. Just do what we can and keep on doing it. I'm so sorry to all of the messages and the questions that did come through. I got lots of DMs as well. We don't have time for all of them. And actually, because of time and because the panel that you see here today are busy and also quite tired people, we're going to just close the Q&A section. But thank you so much to everyone who questioned, but thank you so much to Emma, Nyombi and Stu and Lee, who had to leave, for participating. So informative, enlightening, and also I think empowering as well. We had some very clear information, very real facts, and very tough realities, but also hopefully quite tangible stuff that we can work with going forward as well. So thank you so much to our panel. I'm just going to unspotlight us all. What we're going to do now is just launch a poll. And it's really important for people, if they can, to just take 1 second to click in the poll your answer. And this poll is basically ways that you can join us and help maybe at Just Stop Oil. And there are different ways that you can do this. Some of you might be a part of Just Stop Oil already and thinking, I already know, but we have had some new updates. So there are new ways that you can get involved. Firstly, always is donating. People often try to donate 1 hour's income a month. And it's really, really, really important for our campaign to help us sort of forecast how long we can keep going and keep doing this work that we're doing. The second, attend a non-violence training. That's another way you can participate. We are a non-violent civil disobedience group, so it's really important, especially if you want to take action. Number 3 is volunteer. There are so many ways you can volunteer. A lot of the people you see working behind the scenes on this call tonight volunteer, help out. There's ringing, there's prison support. There is so much that goes on behind the scenes that needs help with. And finally, number 4 is taking action. And in this new action phase, there has been some changes, and we've sort of got coming up some more politically focused regional actions. And a lot of this is happening with a new wave of strategy, I guess, called Stop Tory Oil. Because, you know, Labour's looking to kind of maybe meet our demand by ending new licensing for oil and gas. But they've said that they will not revoke new licenses granted by the Tories. And if Labour claims to stand legitimately against the Tories, then they must stand against genocide of Tory oil. So we're really demanding that Labour MPs confirm they'll end Tory oil within 6 months of coming to power. So far, no one's responded. And if not, we will resist that. So really what we want to be doing in this action phase is writing letters, continuously ringing these MPs, and also taking non-violent direct action to confront the politicians directly, including interrupting their speeches. Maybe you've seen some of the social media already on some of these actions.